Welcome back. It's great to have all of you here this morning at the Arms Control Association's 2015 annual meeting. And just a correction to my earlier remarks about the hashtag for today's event. It's Arms Control 15. My communications team is grousing with me. I told you the wrong hashtag before, so it's hashtag Arms Control 15. This panel, the second panel of the day, is going to be exploring the challenges facing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as evidenced by the ongoing 2015 review conference that's taking place this week at this hour in New York, and which runs through May 22nd. So, as most of everyone here knows, over the past 45 years, the NPT has established an indispensable but imperfect set of interlocking non-proliferation and disarmament obligations and standards. And rather than having dozens of nuclear-armed states, as John F. Kennedy forecast in the early 1960s, we have only, it's too many, but we only have 4 additional countries beyond the original 5 nuclear weapon states that are recognized as nuclear weapon states under the NPT. The taboo against nuclear weapons use has grown stronger. The push for disarmament continues. The effort to fortify the safeguards against the spread of nuclear weapons continues. And like any treaty, the NPT requires ongoing work to update, renew, and implement key objectives to keep up with the times and the technologies. And there have been and are going to be ups and downs. And our job for the Arms Control Association and the rest of the international community is to make sure the ups are more frequent and more substantial than the downs. As we'll hear in a minute from some of our great speakers here, it's clear that as the diplomats gather in New York, the treaty is reaching something akin to a midlife crisis. They are in the process in New York of reviewing implementation of the treaty, considering how to advance and accelerate the lofty goals of the NPT. I think this morning they're reviewing some of the latest drafts coming out of the working groups relating to the 3 pillars of the treaty. Non-proliferation, peaceful uses, and disarmament. And it's clear, as we'll hear, that frustrations are mounting due in part to the great power tensions that we heard about in the first panel between the United States and Russia, as well as other problems in the Middle East and elsewhere. The probability for breakthroughs, I think, is probably low. New initiatives are few and far between, and the possibility for consensus is extremely low at this particular stage. But success is not always does not always translate into a consensus final document. That's not the only measure for success at these conferences. So we have 3 fabulous speakers to talk about these issues and more, especially to consider how, after this particular conference is over, the NPT states can move ahead with some concrete positive steps forward to reinforce the regime. And so I've asked them to focus on those issues this morning. And first we're going to hear from Andrea Berger, who is just arriving from New York, like Alex Comment, navigating the difficult Northeast Corridor in the past couple of days. She's the Deputy Director of the Proliferation and Security Program and Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. And then following Andrea, we're going to be hearing from Dunn, who, among other things, is the former Assistant Director for the Arms Control Disarmament Agency and the U.S. Ambassador to the 1985 Review Conference and knows the NPT very well. And another person who knows the NPT in this arms scene extremely well is our friend and our board member, Randy Rydell, who served for some 17 years, I think it was, at the United Nations Secretariat as a senior advisor to several high representatives for disarmament affairs, and he was a lead researcher for the Blix Commission, which released its report in 2006, among other things. So we've got an enormous amount of expertise on the panel. And in the crowd, as I said before, we have Larry Weiler with us, We have we've got two other U.S. representatives to NPT review conferences, Susan Burke and Norman Wolfe. And so we've got a great set of people here, and I hope the conversation afterwards is very good. So Andrea, thanks for being here. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Daryl, and thanks to the Arms Control Association for inviting me here to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. As Daryl mentioned, I've been asked to speak a little bit about what's happening at the review conference at the moment and what states parties can do to strengthen the treaty in years to come. And as you might imagine, those are two very big topics to cover in 12 to 15 minutes. So I hope you'll allow me just to touch on a few points with relation to each. And actually, the one I wanted to start with dovetails very nicely from the last session, and it strikes me from the first few weeks at the review conference that there's some very real, direct, and pressing threats to the treaty that aren't being addressed necessarily in the way that one might expect them to. You have Russia, as we discussed in the last panel, who's consistently using threatening language about its nuclear forces. In London in January, it put the P5 counterparts of the P5 process meeting on notice that its participation in the process should not be taken for granted. We know that they're becoming, shall we say, disinterested in certain arms control obligations that they have. So if we're talking about reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national doctrine, that's a pretty pressing issue, I would say. China then, for its part, is of course, by all accounts, developing its nuclear forces in a way that I think contravenes the very basic norm that we might think we've established over 20 years of indefinite extension of the NPT, which is that arsenals should move in a downward direction. So if the review conferences are meant to be something of a health check for the treaty, I think we need to try to get creative and find better ways to diagnose and treat the most malignant tissues. And I know that's difficult because you don't want to have those countries become even more uncooperative or have review conferences turn into a giant finger-pointing match. But we do need to think a bit more, in my view, about how we can better address some of the really big and most serious issues here. There are two related risks, I think, at this juncture, if you call it a midlife crisis or have another term for it. One is, of course, that states parties to the treaty fail to strengthen the treaty and really outline concrete new steps that can be taken to do so. I think some of the other panelists are going to talk to that a bit more. So I'll offer a few suggestions in the next few minutes, but I know that they're potentially going to offer many more. A second risk here is that both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, in the process of expressing very legitimate frustrations with the treaty and seeking to rectify those frustrations swiftly, inadvertently create very deep fractures, even deeper ones than we already see, potentially downplay the centrality of the Non-Proliferation Treaty or confidence in it, and perhaps set off on avenues where it's difficult later to course correct if we find that we need to. And so that's one of the issues that I'm going to touch on in the next few minutes. And in particular, two themes that are being debated in the main committee, one that deals with disarmament at the review conference as we speak. Those are the so-called legal gaps on disarmament and the issue of timelines and deadlines. On the issue of legal gaps in disarmament, this is one of the really big talking points. A good example was Monday's meeting in Main Committee 1, in which this was really what took up the bulk of the time in states' comments. And sitting in the gallery, the NPT review conference for that session, it was clear that the discussion is quite frayed over the concept of a legal gap. International law is something that I think should be very carefully thought out before it's formed, and certainly before it's attempted to be formed. And it's clear that some states have thought through that better than others. So to give you sort of an overview of what the conversation looks like at the moment, you have some states who argue there's a legal gap on disarmament because nuclear weapons are not outlawed in the way that chemical and biological weapons are. You have some states who argue there's a legal gap because the term effective measures, as is stated in Article 6 of the NPT, is not defined. You have some states who argue there's a legal gap because we have no legally binding assurance that is unconditional over the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, and NAM is one of the key constituencies that's pushing that discussion. You have some states who say that while unilateral disarmament measures are an excellent bonus, they don't really count towards Article 6 implementation, because Article 6 implementation specifies multilateral negotiations. So I've seen Ireland, for example, make this argument a few times. Some others take it even further and say that multilateral negotiations under Article 6, because it's in the NPT, mean actually all NPT states party. So we need to be having multilateral disarmament negotiations with everyone. And then, of course, you have states who say that Article 6 is clear and intentionally leaves open the possibility of legal possession of nuclear weapons, the threat of their use, and indeed even their use, and that therefore there is no legal gap. So that's a discussion over whether there is a legal gap. Now then there's the divisions over how to rectify the legal gap that we're not in agreement over the nature or even the existence of. So you have a number of countries, a growing number of countries actually, that suggest that we need in the near future either a ban treaty or a comprehensive convention that covers the whole range of issues in one document, so possession, stockpiling, use, etc. As we know, over 70 states have signed on to the Austrian pledge that calls for an instrument to prohibit and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. Then, of course, you have a discussion over where this comprehensive agreement should be negotiated. Some say it needs to be put into a subsidiary body of the Conference on Disarmament in the next review cycle. Iran on Monday, for example, was curiously arguing that it needs to be concluded there by 2022. I'm still not sure if that was a misreading of their notes, but they very specifically were saying 2022. You have some states that say it needs to be in the General Assembly because the General Assembly has broader membership and doesn't have the threat of veto looming over it. The New Agenda Coalition, or the NAC, says that actually let's put all that aside for a second because there's a second option here that maybe we should be thinking about more clearly, which is that you could have an overarching legal instrument with subsidiary arrangements negotiated underneath it. So there's a real range of views here. You have then on top of that the non-aligned movement who says that whatever you do on either of those points, there needs to be a treaty negotiated in the Conference on Disarmament beginning in the next review cycle on negative security assurances, legally binding negative security assurances. So as you can see, the debate is still, I would say, slightly messy. And all the while, you have countries like France who are sitting in the corner and turning to their P5 counterparts, especially the US and UK, and are saying, we told you so. And to be honest, this is becoming a very difficult discussion to have. The French are arguing that all this talk of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, of new information and its significance, of legality and illegality, may mean that in the near future, some non-nuclear weapon states push to revisit the 1996 ICJ advisory opinion. And actually, I wanted to bring out one of the pieces of the first draft, which the French have been pointing to, that says sort of, look, we have a point here. The main Committee 1 draft that was circulated on Friday last week reads, the conference recalls the ICJ advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons issued at The Hague on 8th of July 1996. The conference acknowledges that new information has emerged regarding the humanitarian consequences of any nuclear weapons, and that this information raises significant implications for assessments of nuclear weapons under international law. And as a consequence of that sort of formulation, I've heard P5 colleagues warn the US and UK, for example, that their participation at future humanitarian conferences or the statements they make there may be used to further delegitimize the step-by-step approach and build a body of customary international law against deterrence doctrines in particular. I think that's a bit overblown, but the word legal is being used so much at the moment in Main Committee 1 that it's partially understandable to see why there's some nervousness on the part of P5 states and especially on their NATO counterparts who are becoming, I think, slightly sympathetic to the French table banging, though not necessarily to the way that the French are expressing their dissent, shall we say. This whole dynamic raises a number of issues and questions at a strategic and a tactical level that I think non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states need to think more about. For example, does this whole discussion reduce the prospect that the US and UK will want to engage constructively and positively in the Humanitarian Consequences Initiative, which is something that I was very happy they did in the last year? Will it perhaps increase the likelihood that the P5 process withers during the next review cycle? Because here while they haven't done that much, they've done a little bit and wanted someone to encourage them to continue, at least certain P5 states did, and are seeing not that much of that positive encouragement at the review conference. So if they're not going to get anything for it, perhaps it might quietly fade away. Will NATO states be more or less likely to participate in the Humanitarian Consequences Initiative? And would a broader fracturing of the community over this issue actually result in deep divisions that mean in the future certain NPT constituencies actively disregard the views of others and really just on the issue of forward movement on disarmament obligations, we have a complete split. So those are some of the big questions, I think, that relate to this. You can then talk about whether it's difficult if some states set off on a specific legal course of action and others ignore that, whether in the future at some point when we have an opportunity to build a more inclusive or some might suggest practical legal framework, whether that's going to become relatively impossible to do so. In short, I don't think we're, at the moment, that we're contemplating these issues in the way that we should be and devoting the time and attention to them when the issue is this important. And I don't think that we should not have this discussion. I actually would really encourage it, and I would encourage nuclear weapon states to continue to engage with the Humanitarian Consequences Initiative, and for those who haven't in 2014 to do so in the future. But for focused and forward-looking discussions on these points and the potential pitfalls associated with them also need to happen before we set off on a specific course. And equally, the situation suggests to me that not only do we need nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states to talk to each other more and better, but we need non-nuclear weapon states to talk to each other more and better. So one of the things that I would advocate for in the next review cycle is actually another open-ended working group that can maybe treat some of these points in more detail with more time and out of the time-bound pressure that exists around a review conference. I would also encourage said working group, if it were to come to fruition, to give the P5 process some more concrete, specific requests. If we're unhappy with a glossary because it doesn't have certain terms, say we would expect that in version 2 of the glossary you will have these terms defined for us. To spell something out like that, that's more narrow, concrete, and that can actually really be taken forward as an expectation in the next review cycle. In the same vein, on the second point I wanted to address, we need to think through our timelines and deadlines that we're pushing for in this review conference very carefully. And this applies both to disarmament and non-proliferation obligations and should really be one of the key lessons learned for us from 2010. Clearly, timelines and deadlines can be useful in catalyzing action and changing behavioral patterns when those timelines and deadlines build realistically on the status quo. The deadline that we set for P5 transparency and reporting declarations in 2014 is a perfect example of this. However, our experience with the 2012 WMD Free Zone Conference in the Middle East deadline, which was by most accounts too ambitious, should also remind us that we really need to consider carefully whether those time-bound commitments are feasible, because all it takes is one angry state who is upset that their expectations were raised and then not met to prevent forward movement on an important issue like this. And we're seeing the Egyptians, for instance, advocating that a Finnish coordinator should no longer continue their mandate on this point. So things like the non-aligned movement's proposed timeline for disarmament convention that completely eliminates nuclear weapons by 2030, Iran's insistence, I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, that we need a convention by 2022, the calls by a number of states that we need to have P5 annual reporting on things like stockpile numbers, et cetera, which the Chinese are still miles off agreeing to, and annual reporting may not necessarily be that feasible, at least yet. Those are the sorts of things that remind us that we need to think through what worked and what didn't work from the last review cycle very carefully. And indeed, review conferences are meant to be that opportunity to take stock of implementation of the treaty in the last 5 years, to express frustrations when those expectations are not met, and try to employ the collective to find ways to solve them in the future. But each part of that process, the review, the reprimanding, if you will, and the rectifying, need to be very closely related to one another. So for example, new timelines are unlikely to be effective unless we've considered in detail our experience with previous timelines, and we reach out to those who would be bound by them to convince them that their cooperation would be a helpful confidence-building measure in the future. So this is, I would suggest, my new pitch for a three-part balancing act as it relates to the NPT. Process is as important, perhaps in this instance, as pillars, as we have our NPT midlife crisis. So I will leave it there, but I'd be happy to discuss any other points and questions.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That was a great overview of the questions and the situation in New York. And I hope that Lou and Randy can now turn to the question of how might we in the future months and years address some of these issues. And I would just note that just as Lou begins, if you haven't seen it, he wrote an excellent feature article in the April issue of Arms Control Today. I'm sure he'll touch on some of those points. So Lou, thanks for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Daryl. I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to offer some remarks on the topic at hand of, quote, midlife crisis, the future of the NPT. These are my personal remarks. They reflect my long involvement in NPT matters, but they also reflect my well-known reputation as a free electron, not constrained by official positions. As a preface, I would just remind us all that we are in the middle of the third week of the review conference. There's still quite a bit of time left, and that optimist that I am, I still believe that prospects are good to come up with some sort of cooperative outcome which moves forward the overall NPT process and gets us into the next stage of our life if we're in a midlife crisis. I'd like to make 5 1/2 points in the time allotted. So let me begin. My first point is that today's stalemate between the NPT non-nuclear weapon states and the NPT nuclear weapon states with regard to how to advance the Article 6 goals of the treaty serves neither of their interests. For the non-nuclear weapon states, they have focused new attention on the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, on the need to re-energize the nuclear disarmament process, but they have not and they cannot alone advance nuclear disarmament. For the nuclear weapon states, though they have steadfastly defended their record as well as their step-by-step approach, they risk creating a situation in which today's frustration among non-nuclear weapon states may yet undermine the legitimacy, effectiveness, and support for the NPT. For both the non-nuclear weapon states and the nuclear weapon states, the type of fracturing that Andrea Berger has just speculated about serves neither of their interests. My second point, I believe that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty remains an irreplaceable framework for a livable nuclear future. An irreplaceable framework for a livable nuclear future. Now, we can all agree, I think, that it remains a bulwark against non-proliferation. But I believe as well the NPT provides an irreplaceable framework to pursue the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons. It provides a legal, moral, and political obligation on the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states to pursue and ultimately achieve that goal. And it has produced real nuclear disarmament progress, even if much less than desired. It also comprises, I believe, an obligation that in today's world will not be recreated and cannot be recreated in some type of new international or multilateral nuclear weapons framework, ban, or convention, call it what you will. Why? Because for many reasons, none of the 5 existing nuclear weapon states will today join any such international framework or its negotiation. At some point down the road in the nuclear disarmament process, such a framework may, indeed likely will be, a closing step toward a world of no nuclear weapons. For now, pursuit of such a framework will, I believe, be self-defeating, even if it's couched in the language of implementing Article 6. Third, I believe that the time has come for a full discussion among all NPT parties of Article 6's call for the negotiation of effective measures as a central part of a strengthened and continuing process of substantive engagement on nuclear disarmament among NPT parties after the review conference. A substantive process of cooperative engagement between all NPT parties. I would argue that the review conference has the possibility of moving us towards that outcome with a wide-ranging and inclusive agenda. What are these effective measures called for by Article 6? In effect, what are all the actions needed for implementing Article 6's obligations? Some of those are very clear. Some of those are stated in the preamble to the NPT, and some of those I think are less clear. What are the pluses and minuses of different approaches for pursuing effective measures? If the nuclear weapon states believe in step-by-step, well, why not hold their feet to the fire and have a continuing discussion about, okay, what does this mean in practice? If there are proposals for an international framework, what does that mean? Regardless of whatever approach particular countries may take to how we advance effective measures, there are building blocks that need to be taken to make progress on nuclear disarmament. What are those building blocks? Finally, how can countries cooperate in a practical and effective ways to advance this process? Where are there realistic timelines that could be agreed to and pursued? Where are there cooperative measures that can be put in place now, such as the International Verification Initiative, to try to deal with some of the tough questions that will result? Put otherwise, how can all of the NPT's nuclear weapon states realistically take advantage of what is today's nuclear disarmament law? We just had a panel with regard to the United States and Russia, the outcome of which suggests to me that there isn't going to be any big nuclear disarmament between Russia and the United States anytime soon. How does one take advantage of this lull to put in place the necessary understandings, concepts, activities to take advantage of the possibility of progress later? Fourth, It seems to me there are many different ways in which a new process of cooperative engagement amongst all NPT parties could be pursued after the review conference. Andrea mentions the idea of a UN open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament. I believe this approach could work. There are key details that would have to be worked out in terms of what do you call it? What's its mandate? What's its duration? What are its rules of procedure? A UN open-ended working group is one approach. My own personal preferred alternative actually would be, which is, I think, a heresy amongst most of my friends in the US NPT community, my own preferred alternative would be to establish an NPT intersessional process, an NPT intersessional working group for intersessional discussion of nuclear disarmament and other priority issues. In effect, this would draw on the successful precedent of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Draw on it in terms of the BWC precedent, in terms of approach, procedures, and a cost sharing which would be more in line with that of international organizations, rather than the NPT cost sharing, which I have the misfortune of being the person who probably got the US into 40 years ago, which is very inequitable. If you went down the road of the intersessional approach, it would keep the discussion within the NPT family. It would recognize the NPT with its irreplaceable obligations, to my mind, still offers the best chance for real nuclear disarmament progress. You could create also a group of governmental experts at the CD on these issues. The precedent is that of the group of scientific experts. And clearly, as the International Partnership on Nuclear Verification, disarmament verification goes forward, there are conceptual issues that need to be discussed. What do we mean by irreversible, verifiable, and transparent nuclear disarmament? I could give you a definition, but that would be mine. Okay, my fifth point. The humanitarian impact conferences have focused global attention on the consequences and risks of the use of nuclear weapons. As this process continues, the most important question now is, how does one address those concerns? How does one address concerns about the risks of use of nuclear weapons raised by this process? Participants in the humanitarian impact movement call for the total elimination of nuclear weapons as the only absolute guarantee against the risks of nuclear weapons. This may be true, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. So the challenge is, how do we identify and pursue practical and effective measures to reduce to an absolute minimum the risk of use of nuclear weapons? Ensure that the nuclear taboo is sustained pending the ultimate elimination of these weapons. The non-nuclear weapon states at the review conference have put forward in many cases the argument that there should be the full de-alerting of the nuclear forces of the United States and Russia. The American and Russian officials have opposed this. There's no reason to believe that somehow in the next week and a half they're going to change their mind. So let me suggest two different ways in which the review conference and the nuclear weapon states could address these concerns raised by the movement. First, I believe, and there's sort of something which is kind of in there in one of the drafts now, not much more generally, but I believe specifically the review conference could call for the United States and Russia to task their respective ministers of defense to assess jointly what actions other than full de-alerting they could take to address these concerns, and to report the results back to the review conference. There's a good timeline that you could have. Okay, you don't like de-alerting. You tell us that all you're doing is planning to launch these weapons into the open sea if anything happens. There must be something else that you two could do. Go ahead and assess it and come back and tell us what it is. We want to know what your alternative is. Second, it seems to me, and this is something that the review process could encourage by encouraging the P5 process and emphasizing its importance. The 5 nuclear weapon states, the NPT nuclear weapon states, through the P5 process, I believe should accept the responsibility to take practical and effective measures to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again. Through this P5 process, which now exists, they should make sustaining the global nuclear taboo a priority. Not because it will make the non-nuclear weapon states happy, but because it will serve their own interests amongst the P5. The P5 will be amongst the most dramatically impacted by any use of nuclear weapons. What could they do? They could create a P5 experts group. We've had the glossary experts group, which is likely to continue. Why not a P5 experts group to discuss amongst themselves how could the use of nuclear weapons occur, and what cooperative actions can we take to prevent any such use? Terrorist use, use amongst the other nuclear weapon states, or involving us. Second, I would propose that the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states could work to create amongst themselves a P5 code of nuclear conduct. A P5 code of nuclear conduct in which they discuss amongst themselves and eventually put down on paper what are the rules of the road which govern our behavior with regard to nuclear security, nuclear safety, the changes of our nuclear postures, decision-making, modernization, crisis management. Some of this will be controversial because in my P5 code of nuclear conduct, I would argue that it doesn't serve any of the P5's interest to make gratuitous comments about, well, you know, we nearly went on nuclear alert at the beginning of Ukraine. But the P5 could have this kind of a nuclear code. Is there a review conference role here? Yes, I think there is a review conference role to call for the P5 to intensify their discussions of those risks and again to report back to the review process. The reporting mechanism is a tremendously important precedent that was set in 2010, and kicking and screaming, the 5 nuclear weapon states met their obligation to report. Now I think there are other ways it could be used. Okay, let me finish up with my half point. The moderator asked me to address issues of the Middle East WMD free zone. This is a quick half point.
Only a half point?
It's only a half point. First, to my mind, the Finnish facilitator has made unprecedented progress. What this ambassador achieved, I never would have thought he ever could have achieved. The review conference participants should let this process continue. And they should accept the lesson of nearly 50 years of nuclear free zone process, which is that the results of nuclear free zones have to come from within the region and they can't be imposed from without. Second, it seems to me that the review conference participants, as we go into this end game next week, should not allow success in breaking today's nuclear disarmament stalemate, if it's achieved, should not allow that success to be held hostage to the Middle East nuclear issue. Or ultimately, I believe both nuclear disarmament and pursuit of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, both of those will be the big losers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lou, and thanks for putting on the table very practical, concrete suggestions. And I think, by the way, the term is not free electron, it's free radical. And so some of those ideas are radical, and we thank you for them. So Randy, Rydell, over to you for your thoughts on the future of the NPT and how we can improve it for the better.
Well, I spent a little bit of time contemplating the title of this panel, and to help me a little bit with this, I decided to consult Wikipedia's article on midlife crisis.
We didn't think that deeply about it, Randy, so well, you've gone further than we have.
Evidently, that's the case. The article says the following: despite popular perception of this phenomenon, empirical research has failed to show that the midlife crisis is a universal experience or even a real condition at all. Well, midlife, the article continues, is also significant as a time adults come to realize their own mortality. Also, it involves a condition involving a deep sense of remorse for goals not accomplished. Well, interesting. This is a very fitting subject, by the way, for someone who just recently retired. The first question that we're posing before this panel is, why problematic? And I hardly know where to begin. So let's try a brief tour de table. There is a growing perception among many, if not most, states parties to the treaty that the treaty is unbalanced in its obligations, that its basic fairness is being called into question at each, serially at each review conference. This is not a new phenomenon, but it's getting worse. Detailed intrusive controls are called for in the non-proliferation area, but not matched by parallel commitments in the nuclear disarmament realm. The president of the 1995 conference, Jayantha Dhanapala, once wrote that the NPT's grand bargain is looking more and more like a swindle to many states parties. There is much obvious dissatisfaction over the slow pace of disarmament, or the lack of it altogether. Long-term, well-funded plans for modernization, qualitative improvement in nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Nuclear deterrence remains deeply embedded in the security doctrine of all states with nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states have an allergy against negotiations required in Article 6, against timelines, against discussing even outlines of a nuclear weapon convention, against anything resembling what might be called a disarmament plan. There is a complete lack of congruence between lofty international commitments to a nuclear weapon-free world versus the lack of any reflection of this goal in domestic laws, regulations, budgets, plans, and agencies. Where are the disarmament agencies? It's hard to even find the word disarmament on government business cards anymore, at least in the nuclear weapon states. This gross mismatch suggests that disarmament commitments are simply not being taken seriously. At the UN, there's even growing concern over the uneven transparency. Action 21 of the 64-point action plan of the 2010 Review Conference called upon my office, the Office for Disarmament Affairs, to establish a repository of data on concrete actions taken to implement disarmament commitments. This repository looks more like Mother Hubbard's cupboard, with a very high ratio of rhetoric to facts. Many calls for standardized, detailed reporting have been made, especially by Japan and Canada in recent years. And however, enormous obstacles stand in the way. In particular, China and the non-NPT states are especially problematic on transparency issues. Other long-standing disarmament standards are not being fully implemented, such as irreversibility, international verification, and others. This brings me to the issue of the lack of progress in achieving treaty universality. The treaty growth process seems to have hit a stone wall. Widespread doubts among non-parties joining. Worse, the India deal and others that followed fostered the impression that benefits of international cooperation and peaceful uses of nuclear energy did not require NPT membership. Why join? Better to have your cake and eat it too. It's an ironic consequence also of weakening incentives to remain in the treaty if benefits of membership can be enjoyed by those deals with non-parties. The lack of progress on the Middle East zone is another thorn in the side of this treaty. The Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone was first introduced as a proposal in 1974 in the UN, and many of you might not be aware of this, but that proposal has been endorsed by the General Assembly each year since 1974, and each year not once with one negative vote. The Israelis abstained for the first 5 or 6 years during that period, and ever since then they have also joined the consensus. There is a full consensus of all members of the UN on the goal of establishing such a zone. The Arab group and Iran have been progressively trying to internationalize this issue through a number of gestures. First, they included it in the package deal that led to the indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995, the resolution on the Middle East. Second, they've had numerous General Assembly resolutions endorsing this. Third, they've involved the Secretary General personally as a co-convener of the conference in 2012. and they have given him other roles, and the current Arab Group proposal also envisages another role for the Secretary General to convene a conference after this review conference. Yet, the whole debate on this is wrapped in a sterile, tiresome dispute over which must come first, peace or disarmament. All right, next. We have the stalemate in the multilateral disarmament machinery. The Conference on Disarmament, the UN Disarmament Commission, and also, obviously, deep divisions in the First Committee of the General Assembly on Nuclear Resolutions. We have problems achieving the entry into force of the CTBT. We have problems commencing negotiations on a fissile material treaty, and we have a complete reluctance of the Security Council to take up disarmament per se as a serious issue. Add to this the deterioration of U.S.-Russian relations. How do you get much nuclear disarmament when states with 75% of the world's nuclear arsenals are planning to retain them for decades into the future, while also making continued threats of use, implicit or otherwise? Then there's the endless competition in non-nuclear military areas: intercontinental conventional weapons, space weapons, missile defense, cyber offensive warfare, and then weak international norms, to the extent they exist at all, governing military spending, conventional arms, production, stockpiling, and trade. Meanwhile, fundamental UN Charter norms are routinely being ignored, including fundamental ones such as the positive obligation to settle disputes peacefully, the ban on threats of use of force, and the norm about limiting the diversion of funds from social and economic progress to military uses. NPT disarmament goals, as agreed in 1995, 2000, and 2010, are also extremely imprecise, lacking clear benchmarks or guidelines, because they were the result of compromise and least common denominators. This leads to endless debates over bad faith and compliance. One of the classic illustrations of this is this phrase, reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrines. Well, if you buy that, then you're suggesting that there is a legitimate role for nuclear weapons in security doctrines. So, again, endless circle. There is also currently a deep and growing division between nuclear weapon states and their allies and the rest of the world on the issue of preconditions for disarmament. A widening gap between step-by-step and comprehensive nuclear disarmament approaches is also apparent. It's unclear what had become of the ultimate goal, long agreed in the world community, of general and complete disarmament. It's become little more than a rhetorical slogan now, yet it offers the only fully integrated view of the relationship between nuclear disarmament and WMD disarmament, conventional arms control, and the basic norms of the Charter. It's interesting that the non-nuclear weapon states haven't yet started talking about their own preconditions for complying with their non-proliferation commitments. There is no step-by-step process toward compliance with non-proliferation. So what does the future hold? First, some dead ends to avoid. The NPT, I don't believe, is the ideal venue for advancing global nuclear disarmament. The treaty is not a universal treaty. 4 possessor states are outside the regime. Second, NPT created a universal norm to negotiate in good faith on nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament, but it did not outlaw nuclear weapons per se, although the ICJ has advised that states parties are obligated to bring such negotiations to a conclusion. The NPT also lacks institutional support structures, with my office, the UNODA, providing a de facto secretariat. I think the best hope for the NPT is in contributing to the larger process of pursuing a nuclear weapon-free world through the means of its what we call the strengthened review process. To the extent that the review process can be focused on concrete evidence and results rather than policy statements and diplomatic posturing, the review process can indeed make a very significant contribution to this larger goal, even if only in building international confidence that disarmament commitments are in fact being fulfilled, and secondly, in contributing to the delegitimization of nuclear weapons. It remains to be seen if the data repository created by ODA pursuant to Action 21 will be taken seriously by the nuclear weapon states, but it does offer a good centrally located place for registering such data. Another key contribution, promoting the establishment of the WMD-free zone in the Middle East, is also very important because its fate will have a great bearing on the future of the NPT. I don't really hold much faith in the CD. It is deadlocked. It cannot start negotiations on a fissile maturity and has been unable to start negotiations on nuclear disarmament. It faces the usual obstacles of the consensus rule. And also the CD has a certain other problem, which is the lack of universality. Now, there's a new movement underway to promote the idea of a plurilateral ban-the-bomb treaty, where a group of like-minded states will sign a treaty claiming to outlaw nuclear weapons as a global norm, as a new global norm. There's a bandwagon effect underway, building on strong international support for an international humanitarian approach to disarmament. Finally, this is an issue that has drawn significant support from young people. I think it's important to emphasize that. The problem is that the possessors and their allies won't join, making this treaty far from global or universal. In effect, it becomes a kind of NPT 2 without the nuclear weapon states, or an initiative to disarm the unarmed. Advocates insist that once such a treaty is negotiated, it will be possible to bring pressure to bear on non-parties to join. Yet they offer no compelling reasons why membership will in fact expand to include possessor states. Instead, they put forward a kind of faith-based argument. Trust us, those states will feel the pressure and will yield to it. Yet the models offered by other plurilateral efforts, including the Ottawa Landmine Treaty and the Oslo Cluster Munitions Convention, are still difficult to view as disarmament treaties, given that thousands of landmines and cluster munitions continue to exist and are used in many countries. This does not really offer an auspicious model for nukes. Another alternative is the Nuclear Weapons Convention, and there are many strong arguments in favor as an approach to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world. There are 5 key multilateral norms in disarmament: verification, irreversibility, transparency, bindingness, and universality. A fully comprehensive universal treaty is the only available means of advancing all of these norms in a coherent, integrated way. The very idea that global nuclear disarmament will ever be achieved without legal commitments is just absurd, even laughable. The road to global nuclear zero will not be paved with toasts and press releases. A model nuclear weapons convention has already been proposed in 1997 and 2007 and circulated among the UN member states. The lack of any serious discussion with the nuclear weapon states over this is one indicator of their lack of seriousness about the disarmament goal itself. This is a case of willful blindness, an unwillingness not to discuss but even to think about what type of legal framework would be needed to achieve nuclear disarmament. Problems with the Nuclear Weapons Convention are numerous, political in nature especially. It's hard to get it off the ground if the possessors and their allies are not part of the conversation. Unlike the NPT, the General Assembly does have a legitimate claim to universality, and so, in theory, it would offer one possible means of approaching this issue, through, for example, the organization of a major international conference with the initial goal of discussing the legal requisites for a global nuclear weapon convention. This could later lead to actual negotiations on specific terms for an arrangement, although this would obviously require intensive bilateral engagement between the United States and Russian Federation, as well as close consultation with the nuclear allies. Another problem with the Nuclear Weapon Convention is its silence on the relationship between the obligations of the treaty and its wider international security environment. A nuclear weapons convention is not, therefore, the end of the line for disarmament. The rule of law in disarmament is notoriously underdeveloped. There is also the challenge of achieving universal membership and compliance with the other WMD regimes, the BWC and the CWC. There is the challenge of achieving entry into force of CTBT. There is the challenge of negotiating a fissile material treaty or of incorporating the fissile material issue in the text of a nuclear weapon convention. There is the challenge of doing something about the lack of any multilateral treaties governing the production and stockpiling of conventional arms, of multilateral norms for the trade in such weaponry going somewhere beyond the very frail framework offered by the Arms Trade Treaty. All of these could be pursued, must be pursued simultaneously because the security challenges that will exist in a nuclear weapon-free world must not be approached as a mere afterthought. These other legal initiatives will help to answer the question of what kind of security will exist in such a world once nuclear disarmament is achieved. There is a term for this approach to security. It is general and complete disarmament under effective international control, a goal already found in Article 6 of the NPT and a dozen other multilateral treaties, a concept that has been the international community's ultimate objective since the General Assembly's first special session on disarmament in 1978, and an issue that has been on the General Assembly's agenda since 1959. The alternative to this comprehensive approach to disarmament is some kind of step-by-step process. Not the deceptive variety practiced today by the nuclear powers of steps toward disarmament, but steps actually in disarmament. This kind of step-by-step process requires benchmarks, yardsticks, an accountability process, and commitments to timelines. Precisely the empirically grounded approach now being explored in the draft reports from the NPT's Main Committee 1 and its subsidiary body. The other type of step-by-step process of viewing disarmament as a mere goal is a dead end and a non-starter for the vast majority of the UN member states. The longer it is touted, the worse will be the prospects both for the NPT and the future of disarmament. We may one day find ourselves not facing an NPT midlife crisis, but an NPT post-mortem. In sum, what's needed is reconsideration of a possible revival of a comprehensive approach to disarmament with its various security components pursued simultaneously rather than sequentially. The step-by-step process towards disarmament should be abandoned for the charade that it is and replaced by a step-by-step implementation of disarmament commitments. Transparency and accountability arrangements, including those not limited to the NPT arena, can help to build confidence in implementation while also helping to further delegitimize nuclear weapons. Finally, existing international commitments to disarmament must be grounded in domestic laws, policies, budgets, plans, and institutions, rather than totally disassociated with them, as is now the case. I wish to thank ACTA for inviting me and for their own dedicated efforts to pursue a safer, more secure, and saner world than the imperfect one we have today. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, all three of you, for your provocative and helpful presentations. I think you've kind of thrown down the gauntlet with some practical ideas, some practical problems, and some perhaps impossible problems too. But now it's time for all of you to join the conversation. The microphones are circulating around. Please raise your hands, and we're going to take a couple at a time. Let's take this question up front here, and then we'll go to Norm Wolf in the middle. So please identify yourself and tell us who you want to answer your question.
Hi, my name is Christine Leo from Yale University. My question is about conventional arms control, as it contributing to the goal of disarmament. Frankly, I'm not surprised that disarmament is taken as a joke. I mean, the Russian and the Chinese will say, okay, disarmament, that makes it safe for US conventional power in the world. So my questions, two big questions. To what extent do you see nuclear disarmament as being a precondition for serious dialogue about conventional arms control? Or at what stage of nuclear reductions between the United States and Russia do you see a multilateral dialogue with states like China on a sort of northern hemispheric arms control dialogue?
All right, and then into the middle, please, with Ambassador Wolf.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel for such interesting presentations. My question is to Lou Dunn, and it concerns the obvious fact that as numbers go down, confidence and compliance must go up. So we have this new effort, I guess, by the State Department or this international verification discussion. I think they've had one meeting, and I just wondered whether what Lou and the panelists think of that effort and what other things might be done to deal with what will be, if we're ever to achieve a world without nuclear weapons, what will be a very daunting problem.
All right, so it's a building blocks question. All right, Lou, Randy, Andrea, do you want to try to answer the question about conventional nuclear relationship dynamics? And then we'll go to the second question.
Well, let me address both questions. First, I think there clearly is a relationship between conventional activities and what would be better put, I think, at this point in time, in reality, as the nuclear arms control process with Russians, and the desire and goal of creating some type of process of mutual strategic restraint in the nuclear field with the Chinese, and that it becomes necessary in both of those areas to go at the issues, both U.S. Russia and U.S. China, in a comprehensive fashion. With regard to the United States and Russia, my own prejudice is to argue that it's been tried over the course of quite a few years to find a way to meet the Russian concerns about missile defense as a conventional area. There have been very, very senior level track 1.5 discussions of this, which have actually identified ways where, if the Russians were game, you could move forward on some type of cooperative missile defense. So with the Russians, I'm more pessimistic. I think you're right. You got to work all of these issues on the table at the same time. And in my own view with the Russians is you don't really begin to work these seriously until you get to 2019, 2020, when the Russians probably start to say to themselves, oh my God, the START treaty actually is going to go out of existence and this is not in our interest. It'd be nice to do, I think Catherine Keller is right, we ought to be working all the building blocks issues. With the Chinese, I think we're now at a key point in time. What I've seen working with the Chinese over the course of the last 4 or 5 years is that the Chinese are starting to take on board the notion that if there is a growing military competition between the United States and China, it will serve neither of our interests. I believe the Chinese are taking on board both sides have taken on board the notion that we understand what each side is nervous about. In the United States, we understand what the Chinese are nervous about, and the Chinese understand pretty well what we're nervous about. But we can't figure out a way to move into a process, first, of mutual reassurance, where we take some practical steps, not just talk, some practical steps to reassure the Chinese about what's happening with U.S. missile defense, and the Chinese take some practical steps to reassure us about what's happening with their nuclear modernization. On Norm's question, it strikes me, Norm, that the International Partnership on Nuclear Disarmament Verification, as Catherine suggested and as I suggested, is the type of critical piece of building block work that needs to be done. At this point in time, I don't think we have the slightest idea of a workable approach to monitor and verify the elimination of nuclear warheads. We all know that conceivably when the Russians come back to the arms control process, a next phase of beyond START might actually include nuclear warheads as a unit of account. And so it seems to me this is the type of building block work that needs to be pursued. And you could also fold into this building block work some of the kinds of issues that have been raised in the review conference process. So there's a lot of work to be done. And which could be constructively done if everybody wants to become involved. And a lot of work can be done to try to figure out how do you provide some sense, some involvement on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states. Because the old answer that we would have given 20 years ago, okay, we and the Russians, we're eliminating these weapons. If it's good enough for you, it's good enough for us. If it's good enough for us, it ought to be good enough for you. Trust us. That's not going to go anywhere. They want to have some involvement in this, and this allows us to work this issue in a real way with as many of the players as we can get.
All right. Any other more? Yeah, Randy, Andrea.
I'd just like to, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I just have a brief historical point I'd like to mention on this question about conventional arms control. When the UN Charter was signed in 1945 in June, the nuclear weapons had not even been tested at that point. It's a pre-atomic document. The first thing the General Assembly did when it met in London on 24 January 1946 was to adopt its first resolution. The first resolution called for the elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons adaptable to mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons. The challenge that the General Assembly faced in January 46 was to differentiate between two different goals that are found in the UN Charter. There are two references in the Charter to the word disarmament. There are other references to the word regulation of armaments. They are not synonyms. Disarmament was clarified in January 46 and has been there ever since as meaning the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. Resolutions adopted later in 1946 clarified that regulation of armaments applied to conventional arms and also to reducing military spending. So what I'm trying to say here is that the basic framework for pursuing both disarmament and arms control or regulation of armaments simultaneously goes all the way back to none other than the UN Charter itself. There's a 70-year history here. This is not new, okay? What's new is trying to get it implemented. and to try to actually have these be systematically pursued. A classic example is Article 47 of the Charter, which mandates the Security Council to prepare plans for the regulation of armaments. Have they done so? No, they have not done so. Are they likely to? Probably not. So you can't blame an instrument when it's not used. There's an issue of political will here that is inescapable. And anyway, I'm sorry about the long excursion here, but it is important to the issue.
Andrea.
I was just going to add on your question, Christine, that I think this is one of the interesting aspects about when we discuss whether there's a way that you can try to get nuclear weapon states to talk about putting meat on the bones of what step-by-step process is, because what will end up happening is it will look very much like something that is not just nuclear-centric in the way that some of the working documents that are currently on the table at the review conference might imply. I don't want to give too much credence to the French and the Russian insistence that you need to keep referring to general and complete disarmament, because that's what's in Article 6, and they do that a lot. But there are, if you look at a step-by-step process and how that might realistically pan out, there are intervening variables, there's conventional issues, there's other WMD issues, and that's one of the things that's going to make it very challenging is I'm sure nuclear weapon states do not agree on when those intervening variables are likely to come in, when the conventional discussions in certain regional contexts are likely to come in, where WMD discussions other than nuclear are likely to come in. So.
All right, we've got lots of questions. I'm going to try to get everybody. We're going to do 3 at a time, and I want your questions to be quick, and I'd like to ask our panelists to be as brief as they can. So let's go to the middle table to Susan and Larry, please.
Thanks a lot. One comment and one question. On the verification point, picking up on Norm, I think this is something that the initiative is a great one. There's work that's been done on the issue of latency. Joe Pilot has done some really important work on that, and I think that's an area that needs to be explored both for disarmament and for non-proliferation. The question is, picking up on Catherine Kelleher, she talked about how there's enough blame to go around. You know, FMCT, it's held up by the Pakistanis. The P5 are only as strong as the weakest link or links. On bilateral arms control, it takes 2 to tango. We've got 3 nuclear weapons free zone sets of protocols on the Hill that the U.S. has submitted, no action, CTBT languishing. And this is really mostly for Randy because of your past life, but also for Lou and Andrea if you have a comment. But ACA is doing a tremendous amount of work to try to build a constituency for these issues, and I've always felt we don't have a natural constituency in this country for these issues. What can be done? Because a lot of the holdup here is agreements that get negotiated when they get negotiated, and you can't get them ratified, and all of these other things. I mean, you have to look at where's the problem, and what can be done to fix the problem, and the problems are all different.
Okay, question, Larry Weiler, right, same table, right behind you. You got perk up your arm, Larry. He's right behind you. All right, thank you.
Just a couple of reflections, and I'd like your views on it. I remember when we and the Russians agreed on the text of the NPT a long time ago. And walking down the Rue de Lausanne after we sent off the telegram saying that we had agreed on a common text. And I thought at the time, I wonder how long it will last. So I just offer that observation. We're getting so pessimistic. And we didn't know, certainly I didn't know, that it would go beyond the 40 years, which was the original text. At German insistence. We don't have anyone arguing today for a limitation on the duration of the NPT. So don't be too pessimistic. On a more immediate practical thought, my view, frankly, is that combining nuclear disarmament with general and complete disarmament is a mistake, because it leads people to think you're pie in the sky, don't know what you're talking about stuff. It's legitimate to focus on the nuclear side because that's the one that threatens the future. And seems to me that this combining the two is a mistake, and also it's not factual in terms of what the real problems would be down the way.
Okay.
Another final observation is, as long as the continual meetings that are held on the NPT review include a continuation to accept the general complete breakdown of the multilateral negotiation process in Geneva with this absurd arrangement that they have, that benefits no one but the owners of the cafes and the Rue de Lausanne and other places in Geneva. It's a statement that they don't believe what they're writing in their resolutions.
Okay. I mean, so let me reinterpret part of your observation there, Larry, and send this back to the panelists about, how we can, as I think Lou was trying to suggest, look for other venues, fora that bridge the divides between the nuclear, the non-nuclear, the north, the south, that apparently do need to be created, in part because it's only the cafe owners in Geneva that are benefiting from the CD's paralysis. So if we could just have quick responses to that, and then we're going to try to get to 2 or 3 more questions before our time is up for this session. Andrea?
I'll just add a very quick thought that one of the interesting sets of amendments that keeps going around the texts for the main committee 1 and the subsidiary body 1 at the moment at the review conference is the inclusion of the word preferable in front of the Conference on Disarmament as a forum. So I think there's note that a sizable portion of the review conference community at the moment agrees with your last point there, that we can't continue to just say, well, the CD is the only forum and we encourage it to start moving in the next review cycle. There's definitely a number of states that are saying the word preferable must be going in there. So just that as a thought.
All right. Others?
Quickly. I would not combine nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament, but I don't think you can't work the nuclear issues with Russia and China unless you work the non-nuclear issues. They're interwoven, and we're going to have to work them both together. I agree we shouldn't be too pessimistic, and as the great optimist, I shouldn't be too optimistic either. We need to be realistic optimists. That said, as someone who came out of Hudson Institute, where we used to think the unthinkable back in my youth, I find it easier than I would care to believe to come up with scenarios whereby the NPT, because of this frustration, gets itself in real trouble pretty soon. I would do FMCT outside of the CD. If you can't get the CD to negotiate, let's go and negotiate an FMCT outside of the CD in some fashion, with whomever will play.
All right. Randy?
Susan, your extremely cogent and difficult question on action has troubled me very deeply because in answering that question, I have to not look at my experience just working at the UN, but I also have 11 years working as an aide to Senator Glenn. And I compare the kind of political culture that we dealt with in the Glenn years between 87 and 98 with the circus that exists now and the rivalries and personal and ideological cleavages that are tearing that institution apart. And it really breaks my heart to see what is going on there. I don't have a clue as to how to fix that problem. I've thought a lot about it, but it has to be fixed because it comes back to the point I was trying to make about the lack of internalization of this great commitment we have to getting to a nuclear weapon-free world. Many of you will remember that when President Obama made his speech in Prague, he said that we seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. He didn't say we seek peace and security so that we may achieve a world without nuclear weapons. That's how it was interpreted and translated for the public. And I think that the public has to understand better how their security interests are benefited in a very, very concrete way by the serial elimination of these weapons. I think the military has got to contribute to this conversation. Where are the military leaders? They have enormous insights into these issues that have credibility that maybe people in Congress will listen to. I think we need to increasingly hear from them as well, because I don't think any of them are just serially going to oppose disarmament. I think that, hell, half the U.S. military, the two services branches are already non-nuclear, the Marines and the Army. So it's important food for thought. I think the military has an important role to play. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we have time for one more question. I'm sorry. Before the lunch is on schedule, Tim? Okay. Otherwise, you won't be able to eat, and we'll be behind schedule, and that would be a greater sin. So I want to go, the first person I saw in the next round, Edward Ift, and then we're going to close out. And I do apologize. I mean, this subject could be the basis for about a month-long conference, I think, huh? And that's why it is. So, Edward, very quickly, and then we're going to close out.
Sorry to be the last troublemaker. Edward Ift, Georgetown University. A lot of good ideas have been put forward here, but nobody has really picked up the proposal made by the four horsemen 2 years ago, which was to create a joint enterprise whose goal would be to create the conditions for going to zero. A lot of high-level studies, for example, the Congressional Commission, have said the conditions for going to zero do not exist today. But then we don't seem to be taking the logical next step, which is to identify what are those conditions and what specifically are we doing to create them. I mean, the two obvious big problems are verification and how does deterrence work in a world with zero nuclear weapons. As far as the forum goes, it seems obvious to me 5 is too small, 65 in the CD is too big, 190 in New York is way too big. But the four statesmen's proposal was a group of maybe 20 or 30 states with high levels of nuclear expertise. Thank you.
All right. On this subject of how to move the conversation forward to deal with what I think this is a term Jim Goodby coined, a joint enterprise that addresses all these things in an intelligent way. Lou, you talked about a few. Randy, you've talked about another variation to Ed's question, and then we'll close.
That's the great beauty, Ed, of the proposal for the International Partnership on Nuclear Disarmament Verification. Its whole purpose is to at least work one of the longest poles in the tent of a world without nuclear weapons. And that's why I think it should receive broad support.
No? Okay. Andrea, any thoughts on this?
My only thought is that part of the difficulty in the NPT discussion at the moment is that many non-nuclear weapon states want to see movement on some point, somewhere, regardless of what those who possess nuclear weapons think might be the conditions for such a world, and would probably prefer not to spend the time discussing and debating what those might be, but want something in pretty short order. They've sat there, they say, for 45 years and waited for more to happen. Next year, next review cycle, it will be the 50-year mark of the treaty. The treaty will be half a century old. And they say, really, let's stop talking about the conditions here and have something happen. I agree that the discussion on conditions should happen. I agree that that's, a realistic way forward, but there is also a frustration here that needs to be addressed in some other way, and we need to think about how to do that too.
All right, well, let me just also add one small thought on this. I think Ed is asking, I think, a great concluding question. It's the where do we go next? How do we carry this conversation forward problem? And in my view, this is a question that has not been answered adequately by the non-nuclear weapon state majority, and it is being resisted by the P5. And you can see that in New York right now. They do not want to open up the conversation about nuclear weapons beyond their club. And that is, I think, to their own detriment. I think President Obama and his people are smart enough and really do have the vision enough to see that we need to broaden the conversation some way, somehow. And there were inklings of this concept in not just the Four Horsemen op-eds, but in Barack Obama's own statements in 2009 and 10. So, President Obama has another, 18 months or so left. There will be opportunities for the United States working with some of the more thoughtful, active, and energetic non-nuclear weapon states, some of whom are represented here, we'll hear from in a little bit, to forge some sort of new conversation about these issues that definitely have to be carried forward and worked through, or else, as Randy said, the midlife crisis could turn into something terminal. On that note, sorry, but we're in the nuclear weapons business, so I'm sure that all of you have dealt with the terminal aspects of the subject, so it shouldn't be a shock to anyone here. So with that, we need to conclude and move to our lunch session, but first let's all thank our panelists for their really thoughtful input. And we will continue to press on this